Today's show has been brought to you by Hasayampa Inn, Classic, Boutique, Historic, and by Prescott Honda.
We're back on Morning Scramble right here in northern Arizona. We have a true story coming to you today of an Army nurse and a prisoner of war. And author Melissa Bowersock of Marcia Gates, Angel of Bataan, she was related to you.
She's my aunt.
Did you remember her?
Do you know, I did. I grew up in California and she lived in Wisconsin, so I did not see her a lot. But all my life, I always heard that she had been captured by the Japanese on Corregidor and she was a prisoner of war. But I never knew the whole story. And she and all her generation are gone. She's my mother's twin, and they're all gone. And
were they identical twins?
Fraternal, actually.
Fraternal.
Yeah.
Interesting.
But one day I thought I'd like to find out about it, and there's nobody to ask. So I started doing some research, and I found out that the Wisconsin Historical Society actually has 2 scrapbooks that my grandmother created that they have every letter, every telegram, every photo, every newspaper clipping about the entire ordeal. And I was able to download PDF copies of all of it.
I'll tell you, that is tremendous on a couple of aspects. Number one, the fact that your grandmother would do that, and the fact that she would treasure it enough and give it to a historical society. You know, we have Charlotte Hall Museum here, which is a tremendous repository for local history and that kind of thing. But, you know, so many times these things are rotting away in an attic, or they get tossed away in a box by another generation who doesn't understand.
Right.
So how tremendous. Well, now she was an Army nurse.
Yes.
I did not know that the Japanese captured nurses and medics like that.
Oh yeah, they did. They captured, I can't remember, 62 or 63 nurses on Corregidor, because as the troops were withdrawing, as they were coming down the Bataan Peninsula to get away from the Japanese are coming behind, the Army nurses and their mobile hospitals went right with them. And she talks about the fact that they had to set up their hospitals in the middle of the jungle, you know, and have the guys just out there on cots or whatever, trying to care for them. And they kept withdrawing with the troops.
Well, sure, because they're caring for them, and probably there was no flying folks out at that point. I know they, a lot of times, were able to fly injured soldiers out and that kind of thing. But no, they were just stuck there and not sorted out by the Japanese when they came to get the soldiers.
No, and after they were captured, at that point they separated the men from the women. And the women wanted desperately, the nurses wanted desperately to stay with the men so they could care for them, and they separated them out, and they sent the women to one camp and the men to another, and the nurses were just devastated by that.
Because then the injured had no care, virtually, very little care. Because I'm sure there were male doctors and medics, but probably not the number that there were nurses for them. Was this involved in the March of Bataan? Bataan, was it?
The men that were captured, some of the men that were captured were then sent on the death march.
I see.
The nurses were never on the death march, luckily.
Wow. Yeah. Now, I'm guessing because it was in the jungle that malaria was a huge thing there.
Yes, huge, huge. Yeah, major problem.
Years ago, I interviewed a man who was on the death march of Bataan, and he said that the soldiers, the Japanese soldiers, would either steal their quinine or break their bottles. So many of these soldiers had no quinine to try to fight malaria. My father got malaria in Korea, and it was a terrible disease. Without medication, it was a devastating kind of a thing. What was it like for her being a prisoner of war? How were they treated?
Do you know what? Actually, the first year or two, they were actually treated very well, because the camp, they were in San Tomas, which was a university in Manila, and was converted to a prisoner of war camp. And it was run by civilian Japanese, and they were treated very well. The local people were allowed to come in with their food and their fruit and produce and stuff and sell to the prisoners, and the prisoners could actually get passes to go out and go shopping and stuff. But then when the war turned and things were going badly for the Japanese, that's when the military came in and took over, and that's when the treatment went down the tubes, and they got to the point where they were all starving. I mean, when you think about it, as the U.S. was escalating the war, we were cutting all their supply lines, which was what we needed to do to get Japan to surrender, but we were also cutting the supply lines for the prisoners.
Which were our own soldiers, our own, obviously, medical personnel behind the lines.
Yeah, I mean, my aunt talked later about actually crawling around on the floor looking for a single grain of rice that she had dropped, because she just wasn't going to get very much.
It is hard to comprehend how hunger affects you. I mean, you know, sometimes you go like 6 hours without a meal or something. It's like, oh, I'm so hungry. But to be in a constant state of hunger, and when they were released, a lot of them were, did they lose it? Did some die from starvation? But I know they're very thin.
They absolutely did, yes. As a matter of fact, there was one report that I found by a Red Cross worker who was also a prisoner, and she estimated that for most of the prisoners, if they hadn't been liberated when they did, they would probably be dead a week later.
That close.
It was very close. Very close. Yeah.
Was it the end of the war when they were liberated? How did they get out?
It was February of '45 when they were liberated.
Okay, pretty close.
Yeah, and it was interesting because MacArthur had gone back to Manila, and they heard rumors that the Japanese were either going to move the prisoners or just eliminate them all. So MacArthur had his men just cut a swath right to the camp and just cut straight through to liberate them. Matter of fact, this picture that they're showing now, if you see the woman behind my aunt's in the front, and the woman behind, you can see how thin she is.
Incredibly.
Yeah, and this is at the liberation.
And she looks like an older lady too, but your aunt's still very thin. You can see in their arms and everything. Was this for both camps, the liberation, the men and the women?
Roughly the same period.
Okay, I know there was a great movie on that, and don't ask me the name of it, but
The Great Raid.
Thank you.
Yes.
Very, very touching
Very good,
and
yes.
very tense.
Yeah.
How long was she a prisoner of war?
3 years.
3 years.
Yeah.
That's an awfully long time.
It is.
You know, to
It
be.
is.
What did you have a diary, that kind of thing in your research? Her.
Yeah, not a day-to-day diary. That would have been great. But after the fact, she gave a radio interview, and I have the complete transcript of it, and she talks about what she went through and everything. What was interesting with the scrapbooks was my grandmother was no shrinking violet, and she was not going to sit on her thumbs and wait to see what happened. She was phoning people, she was writing letters, she was calling anybody she could think of to get information, because there wasn't any information. I mean, in this day and age, we're so used to getting information right now, immediately. And when you think about it, my aunt was halfway around the world, and there was no mail, there was nothing. And so my grandmother called everybody she could think of, from the Red Cross to the government to news agencies, to see what information she could get. And so these scrapbooks are full of her letters and the return letters from the people that she contacted, just trying to get any little bit of information.
Now, Marcia Gates, Angel of Bataan, that's a completely true story.
Absolutely.
Was it difficult to write it? I mean,
you know, it was and it wasn't, because I had the material in the scrapbook, so obviously I had a framework. But as I wrote the story, I just was very conscious of not interjecting opinion or guessing what happened. If I didn't know what happened, I didn't put it in there.
Sure.
Because as I was writing this, I thought, even though she's gone, I thought if I couldn't hand this book to her without flinching, I wasn't going to publish it. You know, and so I just kept it as absolutely true to the facts as I could.
Now, in terms of the books, what do people find in there? How did you organize that? You talk about her early life, that kind of thing too? And I
did it chronologically. The first chapter talks about the early life. And so what I did was, as I went through, I kind of interjected her remembrances of the time. So it's all chronological, and then interspersed with what my grandmother was doing in the letters and everything. I'm also lucky enough to have my father's autobiography, and he talks about my aunt. So I brought him into it as well, and the things that he said about her and her experience and everything.
How would it affect someone like that? How did it affect Marcia to be, you know, in a difficult place anyway? The Philippines and Corregidor would have been very difficult, and then to be a prisoner of war. How did that affect her after?
You know, it's interesting. She remained a nurse, and actually a couple of years after the war, she went to Japan and worked in a children's hospital.
Really?
And I thought that said something about her, that she didn't hold a grudge. You know, a lot of people, you know, whoever the enemy is, they stay the enemy, and she wasn't that way.
And the fear, I mean, there would be obviously a lot of fear from what she had gone through of those people.
But her whole mindset was she had a job to do, which she obviously loved, and she did it. And so all throughout the war and in the prisoner of war camp, she was a nurse. And she was helping there and taking care of people, and that's just what she did. And when they brought the nurses home and they called them heroes and everything, none of them could understand that, because they said, we're just doing our job.
And that's what makes a true hero. A human being is just willing to do whatever they need to do to help other people. That's a tremendous attribute. So Marcia Gates, Angel of Bataan, has also won some awards.
It has, and I've been very gratified with it. It won medals from the Military Writers Society of America, and also won a medal from starsandflags.com, which has their own book festival, a couple of honorable mentions from other book festivals. And it's been amazing to me, because when I wrote this book, I really wrote it just for me and my family, just because I didn't want the story just stuck away in a drawer somewhere. I wanted it to be out there where people could see it. I didn't care if I sold a single book, but it's touched so many people, and here it's won these awards. And matter of fact, I was contacted by a man at a TV station in Madison wanting to feature the book in a documentary about Wisconsin's military history, which I thought was fabulous.
Wonderful.
Yeah.
And it is on audiobook. So again, Marcia Gates, Angel of Bataan. You can buy it, especially on this Memorial Day. A wonderful way to remember the men and women who risked their lives and lost them sometimes.
Yeah. And if I might point out, through Memorial Day, the Kindle version is 99 cents.
Oh, I love it.
Yes.
Kindle. Hey, Kindle.com. Wonderful. Melissa Bowersock, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Sandy.
Oh, fascinating story. Marcia Gates, Angel of Bataan.